joining us right now on the Sunday Wire. Thank you for joining us, Anya.
Thanks for having me, Patrick.
It's our pleasure indeed. And you have a new book out, which we just checked recently. It's doing very well, at least on Amazon. And I've had a chance to review it, and we're going to talk about that today. It's about Venezuela. And this is an incredible book. It is a great piece of documented history as well. It's called A Corporate Coup, Venezuela and the End of U.S. Empire, and with a fantastic foreword by Jorge Ariza, the former foreign minister for the Venezuelan government. So, Anya, I mean, this is a great compendium, and I saw yours and Max Blumenthal, your partner's coverage of this at the time. You went down to Venezuela. This is when this is the part of history that everyone is swept under the rug, really, because it's a very inconvenient piece of history for the U.S. government, especially for the Trump administration. But what you've done is you brought the story back and shown it in its entirety with context, in the context of Venezuelan history. First of all, I want to give you a chance to kind of introduce yourself for those who are listening and watching who aren't familiar with you and your work, a little bit about your background and what brought you down to Venezuela at this really important time in history. Go ahead, Anya.
Yeah, thanks again for hosting me, Patrick. I, for a long time, was interested in Venezuela just as a progressive-minded American citizen who'd heard the lore of Chavez and always been interested in Latin American politics. There was a documentary that Oliver Stone did a few years back called South of the Border, I believe, where he profiled these progressive Latin American leaders, or leaders that were showing a different way of governing in the 21st century, where it wasn't necessarily the old style socialism or communism that we imagine coming out of Cuba or the Soviet Union, but an agenda that focuses on nationalizing the natural wealth in a country, the shared wealth of the people, and use that money to invest in society. And I'd read all the statistics about how Chavez, by nationalizing the oil wealth in Venezuela and other industries, was able to slash poverty and raise rates of education and by all metrics, really improve life in Venezuela. But it was something far away. It wasn't a country that I'd ever been able to see up close until 2019, which at that point, I was in a weird place professionally. I'd been working at RT, the Russian state-backed outlet, since 2014. So I'd spent about 5 years there. I'd anchored and hosted a show, but that all came to an end, which is a crazy story that hopefully I'll get to tell one day at the end of 2018. And so I was professionally homeless. And another colleague or friend of mine and Max's, Aaron Mate, was also leaving his job at the Real News Network at that time. And so kind of on a whim, Max booked us a trip to Venezuela, which people may remember, as you say, even though this history has been swept under the rug, in 2019, the Trump administration made this decision to recognize an unknown opposition lawmaker. And when I say unknown, polls show that 80% of Venezuelans had no idea who he was at the time, as president of the country. And it was this absurd, really unprecedented regime change scheme where I say in the book that the United States, for the first time, declared a mission accomplished in its regime change scheme before the change in government had actually taken place. So it was super bizarre. And at the time, I didn't understand the full implications of that recognition the way that I do now. But we took the chance to go to Venezuela and see firsthand how the real situation on the ground in the country was compared with the reports we were getting in U.S. media about a humanitarian crisis, or, that they just changed the government. I went there and saw that wasn't the case. And I just made great connections, great friends, and kept going back. I went about 2 or 3 more times. I guess later that year I went for a second trip, and then the following year in 2020 for a third. So, and I stayed for about a month each time. So I got to know the country pretty well. And then I also made contacts on the US side with people that I met in the world of finance and US politics to try and get a full picture, and eventually even really good sources in French within the Venezuelan opposition, not just the government. People, are very familiar with my public interviews with government officials. The foreign minister wrote the foreword to my book, but I also focus a lot on a perspective that's left out, I think, which is the Venezuelan opposition that gets sidelined by our focus on this extremist opposition group that's just backed by the United States. There is another anti-government group in Venezuela that opposes sanctions on their country and opposes foreign meddling in their country, and their voices get lost in all of this. So it was through all of those contacts that I was able to tell this story that I put in the book.
And I want to sort of take people through this story, because I think you tell it so well, how this situation emerged, and how not one, but it seems like there were 2, possibly 3 coup attempts by the United States that utterly failed. Total train wreck, total disaster. The people running it, some of these neocon retreads from the Bush administration. In fact, we can start there. I'll bring up this seminal quote, which you also highlighted in your book here, by John Bolton, of all people. He says, as someone who has helped plan coups d'etats, not here, but, other places, it takes a lot of work, says John Bolton, arguably one of the world's most dangerous walruses. So, I mean, we laugh at John Bolton, but these people were in charge at the time. They were actually attempting to overthrow the government of Venezuela. And you talked about, you kind of start the real story, kind of what it gets kind of really concerning was August 2018. There was an assassination attempt, it seemed, on Nicolas Maduro. People don't talk about this or remember it. Let's start the story from there, Anya. And if you can kind of just paint that picture of how Venezuela was being put into the crosshairs for a full, this is like combined warfare, hybrid warfare, as you say, as well, in your reporting. Go ahead.
Yeah, that was an episode that really, I feel, did get buried in the whole story of the coup, which is that in August of 2018, during a ceremony recognizing the National Guard, the founding of the National Guard in Venezuela, there was actually, Maduro was giving a speech in the middle of the crowded streets of Caracas, and suddenly there was this giant explosion in the sky above him. And there was panic everywhere. The military came out with their shields to defend him, but this was all on video. No one knew what was happening at the time. It was later revealed that the Venezuelan military shot down drones that had violated Venezuelan airspace, and were actually, later it came out, were operated by a group of defectors in Venezuela, or in Colombia, Venezuelan defectors in Colombia, who were operating on a farm there, planning this for months. The perpetrators actually confessed all of this months later, in a report to CNN, which was very odd to me, because at the time when that incident took place, immediately plenty of people were pointing their fingers at the United States. But then the next day, on Fox News, John Bolton gets on TV to say, I can unequivocally say that the United States had zero involvement in this. So really protesting any suggestion that Bolton or the U.S. government had any hand to play there. And the odd thing about when the story eventually did come out, because at that point, Bolton and others were saying this was a false flag. There wasn't even an attempt on Maduro's life. This was the Venezuelan government trying to orchestrate something to make it seem like there was an attempt on his life. Well, no, when these guys came out later and confessed to it, that they were trying to do it, they made sure to emphasize that they'd never met with any U.S. officials, but that they did after the fact. They oddly admitted to the fact that after their plot failed, they did meet with some U.S. officials. So that's all there in the CNN report. But later, when Max and I went to Venezuela, and Max had the opportunity to interview Maduro about that incident, it was almost a year exactly to the date later. Maduro said with full confidence his government had investigated the incident and determined that Bolton himself, he said, I cannot accuse Trump or that level of the White House, but he said, I can show the trail of this going all the way to John Bolton in Washington, and that he was responsible for that assassination attempt on my life. And the cherry on top of all of this was that Bolton referenced that interview in his own memoir and actually said that his heart was warm when he heard Maduro's words of concern about him. So very criminal psychopath there, Bolton. I mean, I agree with you that I think out of all of the history really of US warmongers, I think Bolton easily makes top 5 of the list. Something else I know about Bolton in the book, which was something I didn't even know until just randomly doing research one day, is that when Bush Jr. gave his Axis of Evil speech in 2002, it was, I guess, right? And, said that Iran and North Korea and Iraq are this axis of evil. A few days later, weeks later, at the Heritage Foundation, a State Department official gave a speech titled Beyond the Axis of Evil and started talking about Cuba and Syria and Libya and all of these other countries that were apparently on the Axis of Evil list. That speech was delivered none other than by Bolton himself. He was at that time already driving the expansion of this regime change hit list. And then he brought it to Trump's administration and came up with the whole troika of tyranny, the Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua trio that he was once again obsessed with overthrowing. So you really can't capture the full criminality of Bolton in one book, but
the real troika of tyranny seemed to be John Bolton, Elliott Abrams, and Mike Pompeo.
exactly.
Truth be known, I mean, you mentioned and talk about Elliott Abrams and his role. I mean, that was a big shock to everybody to see literally the awakening of this character from the crypt of Foggy Bottom. All of a sudden, everyone thought he was finished. You'd never see him again in political life. And he appeared during the Trump administration and was literally on the Venezuelan portfolio, seemed to be managing it. So the fact that you had all these failed coups by the United States, which again, the Democrats didn't jump on, that was basically an open goal for the Democrats. They could have destroyed the Trump administration over that. So we see this kind of duopoly protecting these foreign policy misadventures on both parties. Nobody wanted to talk about it, not the media. Nobody. They could have destroyed the Trump administration many times over these repeated failures to overthrow the Venezuelan government, but everyone just quietly tiptoed away. So Abrams, Pompeo, Bolton, and then this man emerges, Juan Guaido. So this is quite an incredible phenomenon in itself. And you sort of document the emergence of this character, explain where he came from, and the incredible attempt to literally shoehorn him in as a legitimate leader of a sovereign country. Itself an incredible thing. Go ahead, Anya.
Yeah, Juan Guaido's history is important to understand because something that I emphasize in the book is that this story isn't only about Venezuela. This is a script and a playbook that the U.S. has weaponized against many targeted countries. This is hybrid warfare. We're talking about the ways in which the United States pursues regime change when it can't wage an outright war against your nation, or it can't come in with the military. And one of the main tools of hybrid warfare is covert operations and intelligence, military, dirty war tactics, essentially. And a major element of that, probably the greatest factor or engine for that around the world since the turn of the century, are the secret NGO, non-government organization and civil society networks that the United States funds throughout the world. And Guaido is a clear product of that factory. And I trace this through how he came to even be a politician in the Venezuelan opposition to begin with, is that there were these student protests in 2007 against Chavez's attempt to to amend Venezuela's constitution. And I give all of the details of that student uprising in the book. There's a lot of fascinating details there, just about how, these students sabotaged really what was a major ballot initiative by Chavez. And the students came into the streets seemingly organically, created a bunch of chaos and violence, but it later came out, and I document in the book that they'd actually been trained by a group called Otpor, which came out of the kind of the attempt to overthrow Serbia's president at the turn of the century. They funded these student activist groups and realized, hey, if we come in here with civil society groups in a country that's politically unstable, we can kind of, as the CIA and the NED, which is, they confessed to this at the time in the pages of the New York Times, that they were funding these students in order to oust Milosevic. The US basically realized that if they could fund civil society groups in a country that's politically unstable, students and activists that seem organic, they can kind of sway the political energy in a country in a direction that the US would prefer. And they professionalized this tactic in Serbia. And then the main student leaders who came out of that, including a man named Srđan Popovic, founded an international version of that group, where now they would train hundreds of activists, by now thousands, in Iran, Vietnam, you name the country, they've got it on their website listed as having trained activists. And Venezuela became a focus of theirs after Chavez came into power, because the United States really wanted to get their hands back on Venezuelan oil, get their companies back in there. And so WikiLeaks files actually that exposed the inner workings of Otpor detail that they began specifically focusing on the Venezuelan student movement. And there was even an email that one of them wrote saying something, or actually, no, it was an internal report that Stratfor, which is this private intelligence company that basically acts as a private CIA all around the world, writing up reports for the US government and their clients, identified the student groups in Venezuela as like the next wave of Otpor work in the world. They said, when students at 4 universities in Venezuela simultaneously rise up in order to exact some sort of political change, you'll know that the work of Otpor has begun. This is what they said in their internal report that came out through WikiLeaks. Well, weeks later is when this student protest erupts in Venezuela, and there's chaos that shuts down one of Chavez's major electoral fights. And Juan Guaido was a participant in those demonstrations when he was still very young there. He just returned from his studies in the United States, actually, where he was studying at George Washington University in DC. And through that is how his political career is launched. The students then found a party, Voluntad Popular, in 2009. And from there, that's how Guaido gets his seat in the National Assembly. But he's still a very small-time politician. He was very young, so probably didn't think that his moment was arriving in 2019. But that's exactly what happened. He was selected then in 2019 as the face of this coup, I think, because he was so weak that the real players, the Leopoldo Lopez's of the world, some of the more hardline, long-term aristocratic elements of the Venezuelan opposition that were behind him could control him. But also, as one of my Venezuelan colleagues, Diego Sequeira, said, Guaido was selected because of his mixed race. Actually, many in the Venezuelan opposition do not look like the average Venezuelan. They are much fairer in skin. They look more European than, the vast majority of Venezuelans. And Juan Guaido had this look kind of like a knockoff Obama. So he was the right face to put on this coup, but they couldn't hide his past. And it really captures the way the U.S., his story encapsulates the way the U.S. operates within all of these countries. There's a Juan Guaido waiting, I think, in so many U.S. target countries around the world.
So let's take us just, it's important, I think people understand what Venezuela is as a country, put it into context. So Chavez comes into power in 1998, I think, with the Bolivarian revolution, sweeps into power. There was a failed coup in 1994, I think. He did a short stint in prison. When he came out, he went on this kind of tour of the country to kind of connect with the people, and developed a great rapport with the Venezuelan people. And then, so the way the Western governments portray Venezuela as a U.S. as a communist country, and it's got a hybrid economy. It's got social programs. It's capitalist. Explain to me, or to everybody, what Venezuela is like in your opinion, how you kind of observe it as a country, as a socioeconomic system, just to kind of make some context. Then I want to go back into these the series of failed coups by the U.S. But go ahead.
Yeah, Venezuela is a lot like just what I think the model of a country is in the 21st century, which is mostly private. The grocery stores, hotels, any commercial life is maintained by the private sector. But when it comes to just the national wealth and industry, that's nationalized. That's what the government controls. And that's similar to basically what the Russian model would be. It's not some crazy communist state. This boot of the state is visible in every aspect of civil life and commercial life. No, that's not the case. So it's not, even when there were all those pictures of, empty supermarket shelves at the height of the economic war in 2015, that was held up as an indictment of socialism. Well, those grocery stores were all privately run, and the reason they couldn't get products were because of sanctions. They just simply couldn't import goods into the country. And then in some cases, these elite were hoarding goods. And that was why there were shortages, and the government would find these warehouses filled with toilet paper and goods that the private sector were hoarding. And in fact, a critique sometimes that you get in the streets of Venezuela from Chavistas or government supporters is that they haven't cracked down on the private sector enough. But of course, from the government's perspective, once you enter that realm, things get overwhelming, because it's already hard enough to manage a oil economy as a state. And so I think they learned the lessons of previous communist or socialist projects to take a more moderate or advanced approach to managing the economy. I think that's something that we could consider in the United States, these questions of who really has the right to the wealth that is below all of our feet. Is it even the American way to say that some private corporation based in New York can come and exploit all of the land here? I don't think that that's even necessarily capitalist or free market. I think that's a little bit rigged. And I remember when I went to Venezuela for the first time and came back, my friends at the Ron Paul Institute hosted me to talk about it. And you'd think, oh, libertarianism and socialism, these are not compatible ideas, but Daniel McAdams at Ron Paul made the point that in Alaska, for example, the citizens get a check every month because of the oil, that they wouldn't give up their sovereignty, their control over the oil wealth. And America is pretty popular with Americans. I think Americans would rather maybe see their government funded that way than with their tax dollars, which don't really make sense, right? They print the money endlessly, and yet they still have to skim off the top of our wage. Maybe it would be better if we had just wealth that's pumped out of the ground. I mean, that's what makes sense to me. But anyway, that's kind of how I learned about and started to process Venezuela, as kind of just, it's not some, I mean, they're very proud of the socialist banner and using that term and holding it up, but it's not some rah-rah communist hellhole from like what we think of when we think about our Cold War imagery or upbringing. Like that's not the picture. And if we can take kind of a more practical approach to looking at Venezuela, then we can start thinking about how we do things differently, I think. Because that's how most states are today, right? How does Russia run their economy? How does How does India or South Africa, Brazil, any of the major consumers or producers, India, China, they all are, the state has some role when it comes to managing the wealth and the industry within the state, because they've come to the conclusion that letting private capital run wild isn't actually great for it. Doesn't produce a great outcome for the people.
So the legacy of Hugo Chavez, he comes into power, immediately social programs are put into motion, housing, trying to basically rebalance the inequities of Venezuelan society and economy. Hugely successful, hugely popular. Just tell us about the legacy of Hugo Chavez, and then how has that been taken up by the current government led by Nicolas Maduro?
Yeah, for years, Venezuela was considered a model of success through all of the metrics that you mentioned. I mean, housing, healthcare, access to healthcare, all skyrocketed, and there were major issues with extreme poverty in the country and inequality before he came in, and he pretty much reversed that within just a few years. And it seemed that Venezuela was, going to be this resounding success forever, until the oil market crashed in 2008. And that's when things started to get tough. Side note there, that crash in the oil market actually came after John Kerry traveled to Saudi Arabia and pressured the Saudis to increase their oil output, because at the time, the Obama administration was trying to negotiate the Iran deal with Iran. And so they wanted to pressure Iran by tanking their economy, by tanking the oil market. And then, of course, it had the added effect of hurting Venezuela, hurting Russia, other oil producers at the time. So that is an example of how the U.S. can manipulate the market through something as simple as its relationship with Saudi Arabia. Just tell them to turn on the oil spigot, and suddenly Venezuela, Russia, and Iran are struggling. This is what happened in 2008. And then by 2013, which is right when we're approaching the time when Obama really increased the economic war against Venezuela, Chavez suddenly comes down with cancer, and his health rapidly declines, and he passed away only a few months after really revealing his cancer diagnosis to the world. And he was getting treatment in Cuba for some time. But at that point, he'd already made it clear when he passed that he wanted Venezuelans to elect Nicolas Maduro, who was his vice president at the time, as his successor, and they did. And Maduro has since then been at the helm of Venezuela's government. And I think it's shocking, really, to U.S. officials at that time, or now, because U.S. officials at that time truly believed that Chavismo and the Venezuelan state would collapse without Chavez. They thought it was all just built around this cult of personality of one man. And we can see now in 2024 that that's not the case. In fact, Venezuela and Maduro were able to survive attacks on the economy and sabotage, electoral sabotage, and just the ebbs and flows of the international economy that Chavez never had to confront that level of attack. Things were going pretty well for most of his reign because things were stable in the international economy. But Maduro, the fact that he's still where he is in 2024, even after everything the U.S. threw his way, I think really speaks to Chavez's legacy as having built a successful state political project that outlasted its namesake by a decade now.
So this economic warfare, when did the United States really ramp up the economic attack on Venezuela, and how did Venezuela weather this storm? You detail this in your book really well. The allies that came to its rescue, and this kind of reforming of the non-aligned movement that was, very prevalent in the last 50, 60 years, this kind of a rebirth of that. And you talk a lot about multipolarism. This is a big feature, I know, a big theme in your book. But so walk us through this. How did this come about? This full spectrum economic attack, siege, as it's called on Venezuela.
Yeah, I would say Barack Obama really kicked off the most intense period of that warfare in March of 2015, when his administration announced its decision to classify Venezuela as a national security threat to the United States. And it didn't really explain why Venezuela was a national security threat, but by simply making that classification, the US government sent a message to all international creditors or shipping companies that doing business with Venezuela is extremely dangerous, because if the US is describing you as a national security threat, there's a good chance the United States is going to come for you militarily, or there will be some kind of war. And so the risk premium of doing business with Venezuela shot up overnight. And I detailed through several different statistics in the book how devastating that classification was. It led to the private sector in Venezuela losing access to capital streams. So again, the private sector that was running the markets and providing goods for people suddenly couldn't get the international capital that they needed because of this classification, and imports at the same time go way up because the shipping companies that are shipping to Venezuela are raising their premiums because they're saying it's very risky to go to Venezuela. You're going to have to pay us a lot to get there. And so suddenly no one wants to do business with Venezuela. And that's what their officials told me. They said, look, virtually overnight, it became impossible to ship to us. And the United States government celebrated this. Stratfor, the private CIA intelligence company that I mentioned earlier, they actually released a whole report where they compared pictures of Venezuela's main import hub before and after this national security classification, and showed it was, fully filled with goods and shipping containers 1 year, and then the next it was virtually empty. And they blamed it all on socialism and Maduro, not mentioning the economics of the matter, basically, that it's very easy to draw a connection between the Obama administration's attack on Venezuela, because then it also led to Venezuela losing its credit rating. So it went down to a C, the lowest classification that you can have from Moody's, these international credit companies. But oddly, Iraq and the Congo and these other countries that are major conflict zones have high credit ratings, because the US government doesn't mind. Their business is in there. They can get money even if they're technically unstable. That's maybe why they're unstable, so that US capital could be there. But that studying all of that revealed to me how we've gone way too far by then, because we were targeting Venezuela, we were targeting Russia in this way, targeting Iran, thinking that these countries were just so weak that they were going to collapse. And instead, what happened is that it pushed them all together. And what Jorge Arias, the foreign minister, told me in one of our interviews that I quote in the book is, he says, it's like the natural flow of a river. The United States was attacking all of us in this way. And so we came together to survive. These countries actually have the interest of simply wanting to protect their sovereignty. So they don't necessarily mind, if Iran and Russia, Venezuela, they might have all different systems, all different ideologies or political backgrounds. But for them, this is about their own survival. So they've come together very successfully. And I show how in the book to create a completely new world that is beyond the control of the dollar, and it's not going to be based in London or Brussels or Switzerland or New York. It's based in Moscow and Beijing, and eventually, I think, I predict this year Venezuela will probably be brought into BRICS. I think many other nations are going to be joining BRICS this year at the summit in Russia, because it's just now all of these countries have reached a point where you have China and India, major consumers of oil and other goods, so they can provide a market that Europe and the United States thought that they could forever, bully Venezuela or Iran and Russia because they depended on us for money, or that we were going to buy that, if we sanction them and no longer buy their oil, they're going to fail. Well, no, India will buy the oil, as we've seen. China will buy the oil, as we've seen with Russia and Venezuela. So this is what a multipolar world looks like. They're not necessarily basing it all on one currency or in one capital, meaning like political or country capital. It's truly consensus based. And I witnessed some of that firsthand last year when I went to the BRICS summit, because I was speaking to officials that were, they were really debating until the last minute which countries were going to be allowed in during this last meeting. And, India had their concerns and China had their concern, and they were talking about it all in the halls. But it demonstrated to me that there wasn't one country that could come in to the BRICS meeting and say, look, this is the agenda, you have to accept it. There was a lot of back and forth. And to me, it was kind of a beautiful thing to see, because that's how the world should operate. There's not one superpower coming in and dictating the agenda. There's a collective. And to see us actually getting there in 2023 and 2024 is positive to me. So part of what I'm trying to do through this book is bring a positive message to the American people that we can actually participate in this world. We don't have to see it as like an attack on us, or that, oh, they're all ganging up to take out the evil American empire. Yes, that's true to a degree, but we as Americans will be better off if we break with that system, and break with our elite that are basically driving that system, and take our own sovereignty back as Americans. Then I think, we're a huge, powerful country. We can sit at the table with Russia and China and India and Brazil and act like adults. South Africa, we could have a positive role to play in this future world. We just have to kind of come to terms with who our elite are and how they've failed us up to this point. And I think that's kind of being forced now through the world that we're living in. We're going to have to confront it.
Well, that's an adult way to look at it, Anya. Unfortunately, I haven't seen any of them running around the Beltway in leadership positions right now, so that's a bit of a problem. What was interesting in your book, you talked about Iran played a really key role in helping Venezuela, like a really specific technical role, which I think is amazing, and it didn't get a lot of publicity and fanfare. But it really proves the point of everything that you just said. So if you talk about that, because a lot of people are probably not aware of this.
Yeah, it is incredible how these countries came together. And this is a great story. I'm glad you're highlighting it. So Venezuela was experiencing, as a result of sanctions, a major oil shortage in 2019, 2020. And in the book, I cite a study from an opposition economist, an anti-Maduro, anti-government economist, that he really spells out through time series data how U.S. sanctions were responsible for crushing Venezuela's oil economy, because he basically charts out with data points the decline in Venezuela's oil sector over the years, and then just overlaid dates of all of the major U.S. sanctions to have been unrolled targeting Venezuela's oil economy, or its economy. And he found, just by doing that simple math charting, that every major decline, significant decline, 3 out of 4 major declines in Venezuela's oil sector were linked up with a sanction that the U.S. had levied against its economy. And so he said that was the statistical equivalent of a smoking gun, proving that U.S. sanctions were what he described as a surgical strike on Venezuela's oil economy. Because it's not just that they banned the sale of Venezuelan oil in the United States in order to cut them off of funds. What happened, and what's important to understand about Venezuela's oil economy, is that Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world by far, like over double what Saudi Arabia has, and Saudi is the second largest holder of oil. But Venezuela's oil is extremely heavy crude. It's like molten rubber, is how one oil industry insider described it to me. And so, in order to become the crude that we use for gasoline and other products, it needs to be mixed with light crude and special chemical inputs that, you know, are very usually available, easy to get on the international market, except when the United States has cut you off from the entire international economy. These European suppliers of chemicals, for example, or US, they used to just buy these chemicals from the US and get light crude from the US or ship their crude here, where, you know, we had this whole oil infrastructure for almost a century to bring Venezuelan crude in and refine it and pump it into gas stations here. We ended all of that. We cut them off from the light crude and chemical inputs they needed, as well as parts for their refinery plants. So the refineries started to malfunction, and they simply couldn't process their crude because they couldn't pump it out without these products that they'd had for years. And so while Venezuela's experiencing this shortage, you get all of the headlines in the media like, oh, the greatest oil producer, the world's largest holder of oil, can't even supply gas to its own citizens because socialism is so evil and stupid that you know, they can't even get their own gas to their people. It served the propaganda line perfectly, right, to have these images coming out of Venezuela, especially because no one was taking the time to explain that sanctions were actually, this was the deliberate outcome of sanctions. But in the midst of all of this, Maduro decided to reach out to Iran, a country on the other side of the world that also was a major oil producer and also had been living under US sanctions since 1979. So had decades of experience in trying to maintain an oil economy under US sanctions. And they agreed to this historic deal that saw Venezuela swap gold for the products, these chemical inputs in the light crude that was needed in order to process its oil again. And so Iran sent 5 oil tankers, huge tankers, all the way to the Caribbean. And Washington was not happy about this because, you know, Trump, he gave a speech and announced that they were going to send a Navy ship and all these little cruise National Guard cutters to the Caribbean just around the same time that the oil tankers were scheduled to arrive in Venezuela to combat drug trafficking in the region, right? That's why we had to send all those ships suddenly. It just so happened these Iranian tankers were coming our way or to Venezuela. But it was a bluff because eventually the ships made it to the Venezuelan coast, and they succeeded actually once they were able to bring in these Iranian products in reviving their oil economy. They got it back operating again, and Iran since then has made more agreements and more deals to actually restart some of the Venezuelan oil refinery plants that were in peril, and also even work on reviving Venezuela's electrical grid, because that also suffered as a result of sanctions and actually what was likely direct attacks from the United States as well. So who would have thought? I mean, this is the irony of it, and this is what I say in the book, that a policy written by John Bolton, Elliot Abrams, and Mike Pompeo, some of the biggest Iran hawks, neocons on the planet, their policy actually resulted in Iran gaining more of a presence on the American continent than ever before. You know, if we just maintained normal relations with Venezuela, there wouldn't be this Iranian presence in Venezuela that they constantly freak out about or want to like hype up as a reason to be afraid of Venezuela. It's just another example of how our policy has backfired in order to make our enemies, our so-called enemies, stronger. Iran has even opened up its own chain of supermarkets in Venezuela that I visited. And yeah, there were amazing products there, amazing Mediterranean pickles. They had chocolate-covered dates with pistachios. And so I was like, we need an Iranian supermarket in the United States. They had Persian carpets too. I mean, super nice. But who would have thought that an Iranian supermarket would be operating in South America. It's only because of our own policy, and good for Iran. They benefited from it, but it's like, hello, obviously what these guys have been doing for decades, Bolton and whoever else, is not working. We really need to try something else here. Oops.
So on that on the side of the currency, so you talked about all these kind of money shots for the U.S. propaganda machine, long lines at the gas station, no gas in the pumps, supermarket shelves empty, etc., or exorbitant prices, and the other was people with a stack of bills to buy proverbial loaf of bread, as it were, shades of the Weimar Republic. So the U.S. media and political establishment will point at this and say, this is a failure of communism or socialism. Look at their currency. It's in free fall. You talked about the fact they were literally under sanctions then by that point for many, many years, crippling sanctions. But what did you learn? And I saw a great interview on, I think it was Venezuela Analysis, with the finance minister a few years ago, describing how they're planning to get out of this hole. And when we saw the interview, it must have been about 4 years ago, people were like, there's no way you can get out of this hole. And yet they've gotten out of the hole, which is amazing. So how did this part of the attack work? Because there's a lot of playing around with exchange rates on the black market, advertising on American financial websites, other exchange rates. There seemed to be a whole operation to basically crush confidence in the Venezuelan currency. So to explain a little bit about how that went down, because I think that's an important one, because this is used against so many other different countries. And you talk about this system of financial warfare. Go ahead.
Yeah, what you're talking about there is the dictatorship of the dollar and the weaponization of the dollar, and how the fact that for decades, because the world depended on our currency so much, our elite decided to weaponize it and use it to undermine economies that wouldn't fully submit to the, free market, neoliberal post-world order. So I think the history that's important to understand here is the history of the petrodollar and how basically as a result of the oil crisis of the 1970s, the United States was able to reach a deal with Saudi Arabia because of Saudi Arabia's dependency on us at the time, that saw the Saudis agree to only accept dollars for payments on their oil. If people want to participate, this meant that basically, because the Saudis were such a major oil producer, that requires every country in the world then to have dollars on hand in their treasury, which increases the value of the dollar because more people have it, more people want it, people have confidence in it. And this has been the basis of the strength of the dollar since 1973, the fact that the Saudis have this deal with us. But unfortunately, over the last decades, since the fall of the Soviet Union, and the United States realized that it wasn't just going to be some miraculous unipolar world where suddenly everybody obeys what the United States wants, the U.S. decided to turn up the pressure and how it uses the dollar and its control over the financial system in order to hurt targeted countries like Russia, Iran, China, these ones that we're discussing. And in Venezuela's case, when these sanctions came in 2015 and 2016 that cut off their access to dollars, it meant that typically when this was also when Venezuela began experiencing hyperinflation, typically in those scenarios, a country in Latin America that, and this is a study that I actually cite from economists that I cite in my book, they explain how traditionally Latin American countries were able to use dollars in order to combat hyperinflation by releasing them back into the market and then tying it to their own national currency. People would suddenly gain confidence in their national currency again because they could exchange it with the dollar. But because Venezuela was cut off from dollars, it was then cut off from implementing this policy fix that would have simply just made inflation disappear overnight. This is how it's a multi-layered scheme that the US runs there to now create a situation where Venezuela was stuck in this insane hyperinflationary period. You mentioned the website, the mysterious website that was also contributing to Venezuela's inflation at the time. I actually saw this firsthand when I was there in 2019, because at that time, even though there were no real way for the Venezuelans to get dollars, by the time I got there in 2019, because of the black market, the economy was totally dollarized. So people were bringing in cash, probably over the border with Colombia, and just, people were trying to get dollars. People wanted dollars, but it was difficult to get them, and they were very expensive. But when we would go to pay, because we had dollars, we came from the United States with cash. We were told to bring cash because it was pretty much the only way. Sanctions made it impossible to even use debit cards there because the banks weren't connected. So we brought cash, and anytime that we were at a restaurant or buying something from a street vendor, they would pull out their phone and go to this website. Dollar Today is what it was called. And sometimes it was on their Twitter account. Sometimes it was just on the actual website itself. And it would arbitrarily set a random, insanely high price, an exchange rate for the dollar. And so how is it possible that we were in Venezuela, participating in their economy, and yet the exchange rate, something as vital to an economy as that, was dictated by an outside website based in the United States, run by someone that there was no explanation even for who was behind this website. It was just what everybody used. And eventually it came out in the Wall Street Journal that their story was a Venezuelan migrant who was working at Home Depot on the side, just ran this website for fun, which was a super fishy story, but that's what they actually printed in the Wall Street Journal, while admitting that this website was one of the greatest enemies of Maduro because it had so successfully manipulated Venezuela's economy. I mean, that is the level of criminality we were dealing with when I'm talking about the elite and the banking elite, the financial elite that that govern the world. They were able to crush Venezuela with something as just absurd as that, an exchange rate dictated through Twitter. And that shows you, I think, just how far out of control Venezuela's economy had fallen from its own government. How can you be a sovereign country if you can't even control your exchange rate? I mean, they filed lawsuits against Dollar Today in the United States, just basically accusing them of financial terrorism against the Venezuelan populace. But eventually, because of just the move away from the dollar, I think, in the international exchange overall, Venezuela, and as well as building these relationships with countries like the UAE, Turkey, Iran, where Venezuela has a lot of gold. They have the largest untapped gold deposits in the world. So they've been able to make deals with countries just shipping gold over on plane flights. I mean, that's how they've eventually, by forging these ties, been able to get themselves out from under the hole and finding alternative suppliers of the goods that they for so long were getting from the West. That's why we have an Iranian supermarket in Venezuela now. So they've turned things around. The rest of the world has, moved on really from the dollar because of what I just described. Again, that this isn't something that only happened to Venezuela. It's something that many other countries have experienced. Is the way that the dollar became the primary weapon of the U.S. empire over the last decade or so, because they weren't able to just have another Iraq invasion or Afghanistan invasion again. They had to become more creative, and this is the basis. The dollar is the basis of the economy that they're trying to impose through force on the rest of the world. So I heard someone say recently that the dollar is dead. We just haven't had a funeral for it yet. And I think it really feels that way. I wouldn't be surprised. Well, we're already seeing countries exchanging on the oil market with in currencies other than the dollar, the ruble, and other national currencies. So that's a result of our sanctions. We thought that cutting Russia off from our currency, from the dollar, would force Russia to collapse. Instead, because this is 2024, it only made Russia stronger. Other countries are not going to just boycott Russia. They were happy to do exchange with Russia in ruble, and why not? This is the world that we're living in now. So I wouldn't be surprised if, and Saudi Arabia has already actually gone on the record saying they are reconsidering their sole use of the dollar in exchange. And now they've joined BRICS alongside Iran. And so you have, between Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, major oil producers other than the United States now in BRICS, as well as the major oil consumers other than the United States now in BRICS. The writing is on the wall to me that the dollar is not going to be the primary currency used in those exchanges in the future. And yeah, the sooner we realize that and figure out how to adapt here, the better off we'll be.
Yeah, I think you make this point, you make this case really well by like showing Venezuela as a kind of a extreme case study of how U.S. Foreign policy and economic warfare is driving de-dollarization, is actually driving the development of a post unipolar world order, a multipolar order, as people are calling it. This is being driven by U.S. policy specifically. So it's having this sort of boomerang effect on the U.S. in terms of, and the reaction is quite farcical from Washington. And then they look at these trends and they start saying they're blaming it on everybody else, and they're using it as the sort of rallying cry to ramp up military adventurism and proxy wars in places like Ukraine or against China, because the U.S. will lose its position as a global leader. Well, the reason it's losing its position is because of its own backwards policies. But the book is A Corporate Coup, Venezuela and the End of U.S. Empire. This is an incredible book, an excellent and well-researched read. It's doing extremely well right now on Amazon, and I think with other probably book vendors as well. So you've got off to an incredible start here. It's because people want to hear this story, Anya, because this is a story that's not very well told or often told at the moment, but it's so emblematic. This case of Venezuela is so emblematic of all the trends that we are seeing now in all these other theaters around the world. Now, I'm going to play a video clip for you, and I know you're probably going to be in hysterics when I actually play this, because few people want to remember or talk about this great moment in television featuring the former Vice President Mike Pence. So I'm going to play this and then get your reaction. So this was the launch of the coup, or the regime change operation. Mike Pence was given the difficult job of taking to the global airwaves to convince the Spanish-speaking Latin American world that there is a new president in Venezuela. I mean, pretty incredible. I'm going to play this. I want to get your reaction from this, and let's talk about these failed coups, this string of failed coups that happened. That was extremely embarrassing for the U.S. government. Listen to this.
Hola. I'm Mike Pence, the Vice President of the United States. And on behalf of President Donald Trump and all the American people, let me express the unwavering support of the United States as you, the people of Venezuela, raise your voices in a call for freedom. Nicolas Maduro is a dictator with no legitimate claim to power. As you make your voices heard tomorrow, we will stay with you until democracy is restored and you reclaim your birthright of libertad. Muchas gracias y vayan con Dios.
He's saying, "Hola, yo soy Mike Pence." Juan Guaido. So do you remember when that video went out? And then just give us your reaction.
I think Mike Pence got picked to do that job because Trump didn't really want to follow through with this policy. This is according to John Bolton's memoir. He says Trump did not want to issue the initial statement recognizing Guaido under his name because he was a little bit suspicious of the policy, but that because John Bolton had organized this amazing phone call between Juan Guaido and Mike Pence the night before Guaido went ahead with his swearing-in ceremony, that Pence was eventually able to convince Trump to follow through. I think that's an aspect of the story that, once again, really highlights how Washington operates. Well, the fact that someone like Bolton was really running the show, not the president of the United States, who's juggling so many different things, but has Bolton in his ear coming and saying like, no, if you just go along with this policy, I'll make it really easy for you. We're just like, they'd convinced him. Bolton convinced him that this would just easily succeed if Trump signed on his name. And so he did. But I can't imagine Trump actually going to the lengths of delivering a speech in Spanish, trying to convince the Spanish speaking world that there was a new president. That would have been a little bit absurd. And maybe he considered that, like, if this doesn't work out, I'm going to look pretty bad. And so I'm glad that duty fell to Mike Pence, because I really can't stand him.
I loved how he ended it with "Vaya con Dios," you know. But so he's really endearing himself to the to Latin America. And so here's Nicolas Maduro's reaction to this and this effort at the time. Comes out absolutely swinging with an incredible speech.
Al canciller de la República, que iniciemos una revisión total, absoluta de las relaciones con el gobierno de los Estados Unidos de Norteamérica, y en las próximas horas tomemos decisiones de carácter político, diplomático, en defensa de la soberanía nacional, en defensa de la Constitución, en defensa de la democracia venezolana.
So Maduro is basically taking no prisoners at that point. He understands what's happening. This was such an audacious move by the U.S. And then you talk about this. They tried to push there was a diplomatic war in the UN. Mm-hmm. That in itself, and I know you've spoken to the actual people involved in that. This attempt to basically rout out Venezuela's sovereign diplomatic corps and replace it with this Guaido contingent. They literally had the Guaido contingent lined up, didn't they? Practically at the doors. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's an incredible story. You really tell this story, this drama, incredibly well. But just give us a quick, synopsis of that scene.
Yeah, then the Venezuelans will say it's a testimony to their Bolivarian diplomacy of peace that they were able to withstand those attacks. And yes, I'm talking about a hybrid war in this book. So there's the economic war that we've discussed, the covert war through the NGOs and dirty little mercenaries. There's that aspect of the war. There's the media war, which I think your viewers are probably all very familiar with, propaganda warfare. But then there's this diplomatic war that I kind of got a front seat to through my work at the Organization of American States here in DC, because that was the testing ground where they ran with this policy of using a minority of countries in these bodies in the Organization of American States to recognize the shadow government of Guaido as the legitimate representative of Venezuela within this institution. In this case, the OAS is the regional equivalent of the UN dealing with Latin America and the Caribbean. And this was the realm where they first attempted the strategy that they later hoped to roll out at the UN. According to the rules of both groups, the OAS and the UN, changes cannot be made to the body without the approval of 2/3 of the General Assembly, which would mean the highest representative president at a General Assembly meeting. Typically, foreign ministers would vote to actually make a policy change, or head of state, even if it's at the UN, to make a policy change, such as, getting rid of Maduro's government and bringing in this shadow government. But what the U.S. decided to do was, instead of obeying the rules, because they knew they couldn't get the majority of OAS states to approve this change, they went ahead at just one of their regular permanent council meetings, called a vote, which was a completely against procedure of all present countries, which means if it's a vote conducted in that manner, you only need a simple majority to pass. And that's what they did. They just, at a random council meeting when the U.S. was chair, because it's a rotating chair, the U.S. came in and just called for a vote, said, we're going to vote to remove the Venezuelan representative and replace it with this guy who's working for a think tank in D.C., Gustavo Tarre, who'd previously fled Venezuela for participating in an assassination attempt on Maduro. But yeah, this is the figure that they ended up voting in to replace Venezuela at the OAS. Venezuela had already petitioned to leave the OAS and was through a process of exiting the group because they said it was too partisan, too controlled by Washington to begin with. So it was kind of a symbolic move that the U.S. ended up replacing their government with this shadow government because, again, there's no real foreign ministry or government that they had in Caracas to actually coordinate with this shadow group. They were just sitting there warming chairs, basically, and collecting money. But at the UN, they wanted to do this at the General Assembly meeting, again, hoping that the precedent that they'd rolled out at the OAS with a simple majority, what they were planning to do was when Venezuela took the floor to address the UN, the U.S. was going to, and this was the plan because I was speaking with diplomats in the UN who were aware of this at the time, that the U.S. was going to call for a vote on the illegitimacy. They were going to say this is not a legitimate government. All countries in favor of blocking Venezuela from speaking say aye. And if their country, if like all of the U.S. allied states were present on the floor in that moment, because the UN General Assembly is very busy, not everybody's present for every single speech. There's a lot of backdoor meetings happening, events happening, so that, it's not like every country's just sitting there all day watching the speeches. They might come in and out. And so Venezuela, for months, was lobbying their allies, saying, look, you have to be there when we are giving this speech because the U.S. is going to make sure all of their European and Latin American stooges are there to vote in order to block us from speaking. And this is something that can be used against any of us in the future. That's the main message of the Venezuelans when they're at the UN is like, it's us today, it's you tomorrow. And other countries understood that as well. And so it was really the African states, because there are 54 African nations. So out of the 192 members of the UN, that's a huge block that if you can get the African states to vote in your favor, that's a pretty good defense. And Venezuela succeeded in that way by having all of their friends present on the floor when Delcy Rodriguez, the vice president, came up to speak. And because of that, because it was so obvious that there were too many pro-Venezuela or, just pro-sovereignty countries on the floor, that the U.S. didn't even go ahead with calling the vote. Instead, they just stormed out. They got up and marched out of the UN and tried to protest her in that way, to protest Delcy in that regard. And in that, kind of symbolic, ridiculous moment. It was embarrassing, honestly, to see the Americans behave that way because it's supposed to be an international forum for diplomacy, and they acted like toddlers who didn't get candy that they wanted. But yeah, the Venezuelans say that it is thanks to their Bolivarian diplomacy of peace, that's what they call it, that they were able to survive. And that's, I think, what Jorge Arreaza writes in the foreword to the book. He said, we were able to weather all of these storms, whether it was the economic war, the diplomatic war, because of our friends. He says something like, it turns out that a diplomatic policy or an international relations based on mutual respect for sovereignty is the greatest defense you can have of your own. Because yes, that's all that it takes is they're telling these other countries, look, we don't have to agree about everything ideologically when it comes to how we run our governments. This is just about making sure that as long as we all stick together, we will all be able to maintain our sovereignty. Because yeah, we're the greatest. There are more of us than there are of them. That's pretty much the message that won at the UN. And it's why even with all of the tools that the US has in terms of blackmail and pressure through financial incentives and whatnot, that they still failed at the UN because as Samuel Moncada, the Venezuelan ambassador to the UN, said to me, might is right is not the strategy, is not the way that succeeds at the UN or in these international bodies. And the US has just gone too far, really exposed itself. And I think this coup really, the Venezuela coup specifically, just demonstrated how out of touch, how overboard we'd gone with our international affairs strategy, if you could even call it that. I don't know if there is even a strategy. It's kind of just see what works, what violence and extreme acts work. The last point that I'll add there is that when Chavez came into office in Venezuela, they didn't have relations with most African countries. So they had maybe one or two embassies in Africa. But by the time Venezuela was up against the United States at the UN under Chavez, who prioritized building relations with Africa, they had relations with all of the African states, and they were really the bloc that helped defend Venezuela the strongest on the international stage.
And to carry out this type of a sophisticated corporate coup, as you're calling it, and there was the I think it was the Francisco Fadaro Highway, where they tried to bring in weapons through aid trucks, and then there was the whole Farrago, Richard Branson holding a concert over the border in Colombia, the U.S. mercenaries caught on a fishing boat or a wreck boat or something like that. I mean, it was one failed coup attempt after the other, and then Juan Guaido going around on a sort of junket tour in the U.S. At some point, this started running out of money, so the U.S. then seized the assets of the Venezuelan state oil company, or Citgo. So the Citgo conspiracy, literally, stealing the whole industry. They've actually done this. What is the status of Citgo? Just explain quickly, because that's another one that is just so crazy and audacious, but nobody kind of condemns because it's such a dangerous precedent to fund Juan Guaido. Go ahead.
This is the crux of the corporate coup, is that while it failed in achieving any material change on the ground in Caracas, it did succeed in carrying out a coup against Venezuela's financial assets stored in the United States and elsewhere abroad, including the United Kingdom. There, they succeeded because simply by the fact that they were willing to weaponize their control again over the banks, they seized Venezuela's internationally stored assets, billions of dollars worth of assets, including Citgo Petroleum, which is a company here in the United States, a subsidiary of Venezuela's state-run oil company, PDVSA. And yeah, for years, we imported Venezuelan oil, refined it, and processed it, pumped it up through Citgo gas stations all around the country. But since 2019, since the initiation of this coup, the U.S. government actually seized those assets, all of them, and is now importing oil from other sources. I'm not actually sure, but they're no longer supplying from Venezuela. And they took these bank accounts and the actual infrastructure of Citgo and have frozen it and they did it at a time when it just so happened that there were all of these corporate vultures that were suing Venezuela's state for not having nationalized its industry. So all of these upset private industry titans. There's a Crystalex is the one that I focus on or discuss the most in the book. This was a gold mining company that had a contract to exploit one of Venezuela's gold mines. Well, Venezuela nationalized that gold mine and decided that Crystalex couldn't come and operate in the country. And Crystalex retaliated by suing Venezuela's government in court and eventually winning like a multi-billion-dollar settlement, because all of these courts, and I describe it all, I get into the details of this in the book, but they are rigged in favor of private equity or private capital, private industry. And so, yeah, wow, this court that's owned by or run by international finance says, oh yeah, Venezuela's government owes you X amount. I think it was $2 billion because they nationalized this mine. It's insane that a court can come down with such a ruling, but in reality, there was no way that they could force the Venezuelan government to pay out to this company. And this is just one example of a company that was suing the Venezuelan state and won this kind of settlement. That was the case until this corporate coup. Now, because suddenly all these Venezuelan assets belonging to the Venezuelan state are frozen and in the hands of the US government, they can start dividing it up and handing it out to these corporate vultures. And that's what happened as a result of this corporate coup. The agents that worked as representatives of the Guaido government, I detail in depth in the book, all have deep ties to these corporate entities that are now profiting and feeding off of these assets. Basically, a stolen, it's modern day piracy. They just seized the assets arbitrarily because they could, and are now dividing it up between these companies that sued Venezuela in these international courts. And Jose Ignacio Hernandez, this is the man who was appointed the general prosecutor, or kind of the version of Guaido's attorney general in his shadow government. He had previously worked as a paid witness for Crystalex, the company suing Venezuela in U.S. courts in order to win Citgo, win Venezuelan assets. He'd worked for that company as a paid witness. Okay, so then how was he legally able to work representing that government? That's what happened, because in the eyes of the U.S. courts, when they recognized Guaido's government, suddenly this man is running the Venezuelan legal strategy, even though he'd not only been paid by this company, but multiple companies that had sued Venezuela in court had contracted him as a witness, as an attorney, as an expert in Venezuelan law. And so he was literally playing for the other team. And I personally just have to believe that was not an accident. That I think the people who crafted this coup policy, maybe people that are smarter than John Bolton, who's like the muscle that they put out there to make this policy go, knew that they were never going to change the situation on the ground in Venezuela. And Guaido, look, they don't even respect him. Look how they hung him out to dry. He was just a nice marionette to have run around for a little while. I don't think they even really had confidence in him. But they knew that if they recognized this shadow government, it would provide cover for them to carry out this theft, this looting of Venezuela's internationally stored wealth. Because another great example is what happened in the UK, where Venezuela has stored gold bullion, and the way many countries do in foreign treasuries. Don't think they'll be doing that anymore in London and the United States. I mean, that's the lesson here. Look, they can take Citgo, they can walk away with Citgo. All it means is that in the future, countries aren't going to trust us. They're not going to do business here, or they're going to protect their assets, put them somewhere else. So it's our loss in the end. But in the UK, many people may not realize this. I actually didn't know this until I sat down to write the book. But in 2018, in September of 2018, so we're talking about around the time of the attempt on Maduro's life, Maduro and the Venezuelan government issued a repatriation request to the United Kingdom to ask to bring their gold back. And then it just so happens 3-4 months later, the UK recognizes Juan Guaido as president and says, oh, we don't know who's president of your country anymore. So remember that you asked us for all that gold? Well, we're just going to hold on to it now until you guys figure out who's actually governing your country. Well, who benefits from that? In the meantime, it's just London. They're experiencing a gold shortage. Who knows what's in the vaults of London or in the United States? They started to panic. And I think just they were like, wait, yeah, let's recognize this shadow government. Who cares what happens in Venezuela, actually? But then we can say, oh, no, we can't give you this gold back. And it's just going to sit in London and for the rest of time. So it's kind of like how in the past, pirates were looting ships on behalf of the British Crown. It doesn't really seem like anything has changed in 2024. And that's certainly how the Venezuelans feel.
White collar piracy there. Yeah, I mean, this Navalny, they could try the same thing with an Alexei Navalny. Theoretically, I don't think it would be that easy in Russia or another. Just pick your sort of puppet leader wherever. They could have done it in Ukraine if they had resistance. They could have presented Zelensky as the legitimate president. They didn't have to in the end. But it is just really incredible. So just by the political designation of that's the legitimate government and not the actual elected sovereign one, we say that it's like, and we can impose sanctions on that basis. We can have these bent court cases. That's kind of scary in itself, Anya, because if they can do that to a whole country in a U.S. court with no basis at all, legally or with no precedent. They could do it to anybody at that
Yeah.
point. There's a level of corruption there that's deeply ingrained.
Well, it's a lesson because Venezuela found out that if you have gold or assets stored in a U.S. bank, you can be told one day that you don't actually have that. That's not your gold and it's not your assets. I think people should maybe consider that for themselves as well, because we know how these banks work. They might one day say, "Oh, all of that money you think you have stored in here, it's not actually there." But there was gold also in the United States that, through this manipulation, ended up basically in accounts belonging to the New York Federal Reserve. So what is that other than theft? It's absolutely absurd. And I think they got away with it with Venezuela because of it's an American, we share this continent. We have this deep relationship with Venezuela all of these years where they were so dependent on us. We were so integrated with them because they were basically just like our puppet country. That it was the best candidate for this kind of corporate coup. I agree. With Russia, it would have become more complicated. With Iran, any of those countries, it wouldn't have worked in the same way. It's because of Venezuela's wealth, and it's because of this historic relationship we have with them where they were so dependent on us that we really mistreated them. And it is a message, a lesson and a message to the rest of the world, which they've already heard loud and clear, which is, don't trust the United States government and get away from the dollar because they're just using it to hurt all of us. Again, since I'm an American and my family's here, and I'm not coming at this as like, oh, screw the United States, it needs to fall. And no, I would like us to have some sort of reasonable wake-up call here and evolve and do a better job for all of us, because I don't want people here to suffer, but I worry sometimes that that's what we're getting to because of the ineptitude of our leaders.
Yeah, America can certainly be a force for good in the world, a source of prosperity, and for itself and for everyone that they do business with and interact with. Certainly, I absolutely share your feelings there. But it didn't end there. The last little episode vignette I want you to share with us was they actually went to seize the Venezuelan embassy in Washington, D.C., and you and Max Blumenthal and your other colleagues had a front row seat of that whole thing. And I remember watching that live. It was streamed on RT. One of the best bits of broadcasting RT ever did was the live stream of the occupation of the Venezuelan embassy in Washington, D.C. And there you were. I remember when you were all frog marched out at the very end, trying to preserve the possessions of the Venezuelan state personally. But I mean, just explain how that experience was. We just got a couple of minutes left, but this is such a important story because you were directly involved in this. But go ahead.
Yeah, there are so many wild chapters in this coup episode, but this was perhaps the most absurd. Though I don't know, there were so many crazy ones. Eventually, the U.S. government decided that it needed to legitimize this coup attempt in some way, since nothing was changing on the ground in Venezuela. And they decided, well, again, like the bank accounts they control in the United States, what's something else that they could assert control over? The Venezuelan embassy in Washington, D.C. Now, according to international law, according to diplomatic law, embassies are the sovereign territory of the country that operates the embassy. So the Venezuelan embassy in the United States is not U.S. territory. It's actually sovereign territory of Venezuela, just like any other embassy here. You cannot have embassies actually without that prerequisite, like without that factor. You just wouldn't be able to negotiate or like have proper rights as an embassy if you weren't acknowledged as the sovereign territory of the state. So the U.S., because they'd already announced that they'd recognized the shadow government and given Venezuelan government officials actually a notice telling them they had to leave the country, all of these Venezuelan government buildings in the U.S. were sitting around empty. And so in the beginning of April 2019, within weeks of this coup attempt, they started marching into these offices and they overtook the New York consulate building. They took the military attaché in DC just because no one was there. And the big prize was the main embassy building in Georgetown. But some U.S. activists, namely Medea Benjamin from Code Pink, outsmarted the U.S. officials that were getting ready to seize the building and said, hey, wait, they got these other buildings because no one was there. What if I, with the permission of the actual Venezuelan government, went inside this embassy in D.C. and sat there and basically sent a message to the U.S. like, if you're going to take this wild step of invading a foreign embassy, you're also going to have to arrest an American who's not even breaking the law, who's there at the invitation of the legitimate government. So it was a very crafty move on Medea's part. And then it spread. Within a few days, she was not the only one in the embassy, and I eventually came. Max was there as well. And for a while, it was just like a feel-good kind of festival atmosphere. People were hanging out, doing their work, just maintaining a presence in the space so that no one could come in and take it. But as that went on and the U.S. got more frustrated, what ended up happening is that they basically sent out a memo, I guess, to the Venezuelan diaspora and said, convene on this embassy and try to pressure these people into leaving because, well, it was basically Carlos Vecchio, the ambassador representing Guaido here in the U.S., the ambassador, who I exposed as not just a typical politician, but he was actually the lead attorney representing ExxonMobil in Venezuela when it was fighting Venezuela for having nationalized its oil reserves. So he's a corporate tool, another one of these corporate criminals. Exxon, of course, being one of the companies that can now buy up Citgo in a fire sale. So they're benefiting from this insane policy and attack on Citgo as well. Carlos Vecchio was the leader of this group. He was out there every day rallying his troops, essentially. And they came and were allowed to set up tents on actual embassy property, like right underneath the window, which I could never imagine in my life seeing at any other embassy. In fact, at the time, we would say, can you imagine this happening at the Israeli embassy? Well, right now, there is an encampment at the Israeli embassy, a protest against this genocide, this war in Gaza. And I mean, the Israeli embassy has a huge fence around it, so you can't get actually that close to it anyway. But they would have never allowed these people running this encampment to camp up under the windows of the Israeli embassy. Can you imagine? No. But they were allowed, they were doing that in DC at the Venezuelan compound. And this standoff went for several days. Basically, their strategy was to terrorize people that were inside the building into leaving. They banged pots and pans all day. They blocked food. Like we had some like snacks and supplies that had come in just when we were there. But once this group showed up, we didn't have time to prepare, realizing that we like wouldn't be able to get food in or out again. And they did. They blocked the doors and they openly said, like, we're going to starve you out. It was kind of a metaphor for what the U.S. did to Venezuela with sanctions. We're going to make you starve until you overthrow your government. That's what they were doing with this embassy in DC. And so, yeah, we didn't have food for a while. There was like, I was eating like a piece of peanut butter or bread and peanut butter a day. And Max did try to lead some kind of clandestine operations to get us food at night. And these people were violent. They actually threw punches and tried to get into physical confrontations with our friends on the outside of the building. They even eventually cooked up a fake charge against Max and another friend of ours, Ben Rubenstein, and both of them were jailed. Max actually spent like over a day in prison. And then eventually they threw the charge out because they admitted that all of the police evidence and pieces of evidence that Max's attorney had asked for miraculously didn't exist. There was the police scanner had somehow disappeared from that night. And there was a video of the woman who'd alleged to be the victim of the assault hopping on two different, like one day she was hopping, limping on one foot, on her right foot. The next day it was her left foot. Like she was lying. And so they just dropped the charges, but they did like go as far as to try to jail Max and another friend. They did the same thing with Medea Benjamin. Actually, months later, she was at a protest against Debbie Wasserman Schultz, the tool of the Democratic Party and Cuba, Israel lobby in Florida. So Medea was holding a sign just like for peace, and these crazy people pushed her, and so she fell onto Debbie Wasserman Schultz. It was all on video. But then they actually called in a police report and accused Medea of assaulting a congressperson. So the police like showed up on motorcycles and bikes and surrounded Medea's house. She demanded to see an arrest warrant, which they didn't have. And then when she showed them video of what had actually happened, where she was the one that was actually a victim of assault, they went away. But that's how these people operate. I mean, they are liars and they are violent. And that's what we were confronting outside of the embassy. And basically at that point, because the US didn't want to establish this horrible precedent of invading an embassy in DC, because of the message that would send to every other country, every other government around the world was watching that. Because this is the United States, this is Washington, D.C. If this can happen to the Venezuelan embassy, it can happen to any embassy in Washington. Should be afraid. So the U.S. didn't want to take that drastic step of actually invading. And so they were outsourcing their operation to this violent mob. And eventually they just gave up and were like, okay, we have to go in with the Secret Service. And by then I had already left, because they pretty much warned us that anybody who remained past a certain point was going to get arrested. And we just decided, like, there were 4 people, Margaret Flowers, Kevin Zeese, Adrian Pine, and David Paul, who were like, 4 is a good enough number where we can stay back and get arrested and kind of fight this in court, force the US government to defend its policy and decision to invade an embassy. So they stayed behind and were eventually marched out by the Secret Service and charged in a federal court. And then eventually they reached a plea deal because they couldn't get a conviction there. It was so confusing. The lawsuit, they wouldn't allow the defense to explain the coup or talk about what was happening at the embassy or why there were like these people trying to fight for it. So it resulted in 2 hung juries, or maybe just 1. And they decided, the government's like, we're not going to prosecute this again. But yeah, the embassy in Georgetown sits empty to this day. That means Venezuelan Americans cannot get consular services in the United States. They have to go to Mexico. They have to go to Canada if they want to renew their passport. That means Americans who want to go to Venezuela cannot get proper visas and assistance. It is one of the biggest tragedies to come out of all of this, because you're really talking about real people in their lives at this point, that they can't just get something as basic as consular services to go see their families anymore. And it's just a stubborn policy to refuse to admit this coup didn't work, and that we should just have relations with the real government of Venezuela so that people can get the help that they need. But yeah, I don't know. It seems like an easy solution. Like we could just wake up one day and do a better job. But like you say, I don't have a whole lot of confidence in the people running things here. So
yeah, it's an extraordinary saga, which I think you just document so well in your book, The Corporate Coup, Venezuela and the End of U.S. Empire, by author Anya Parampil, here with a great foreword again by Jorge Ariza, foreign minister of Venezuela, and some very good reviews by a lot of, I think, very influential people as well, including Roger Waters gave you a very flattering quote on the cover of your book. That's definitely something. So that's a great effort, Anya. I know it's a lot of work to put a book together. I'm sure it took a lot of effort and time and commitment, but I think it's worth it. I think you've notched a really important point in history here, where your book is going to provide a lot of people going forward with a great reference material, and again, well researched as well. You provide the footnoting in this book is very detailed as well. So I think, I think this is just going to, be in perpetuity a great asset. And congratulations on the book, The Corporate Coup, and all your work going forward. You guys are very busy at the Gray Zone. You're doing amazing work, your whole team, and making a big impact as well. So we look forward to your future reportage on this and other topics going forward. But I really appreciate you joining us on the Sunday Wire this week.
Thank you, Patrick. I really appreciate your kind words, because yes, it was a long slog to get that get that done. And sometimes I didn't think I was going. Well, I always knew that I was going to, but it sometimes felt like it was just always off far in the distance. So I appreciate it when you say those very nice things about my work.
And it's great that people are taking it up as well. And just before do you have any is it available in Spanish?
It will be hopefully later this year.
Yeah, I think a few languages would be interested in this book: French, Russian, Spanish, Chinese. I think there's a good global market for this book. So that's another part of it, hopefully, that will happen.
That'll be the next phase. We'll go global.
But thank you very much, Anya. Appreciate it. Take care. All the best. There she goes, ladies and gentlemen. That is Anya Parampil, author of A Corporate Coup. And again, we'll put that up on screen. The Corporate Coup, Venezuela and the End of U.S. Empire. Highly recommended. We'll drop the link as well on Amazon to this book in our chat community at 21st Century Wire, also on X and other platforms, as well as the link in the description here in the live stream on YouTube and Rumble as well. So just stay with us, and we'll see you very shortly.